Imagine a war for global industrial supremacy. But this war isn't fought with warships on the high seas. It's fought with thousands of pages of legal arguments, dense economic data, and meticulous expert testimony. The battlefields are not oceans, but the quiet, sterile hearing rooms of the World Trade Organization in Geneva. This is the story of the shipbuilding subsidy war, a decades-long industrial conflict waged between two of Asia's titans, Japan, the established master, and South Korea, the relentless challenger. For over 20 years, these two nations have been locked in a bitter struggle, accusing each other of unfair practices that distort the multi-billion-dollar global market for building the massive vessels that carry the world's trade. At the heart of this conflict lies a fundamental question. How did South Korea, a nation ravaged by war just decades earlier, build a shipbuilding empire that managed to eclipse its former colonial ruler and the world's undisputed leader, Japan? And more pointedly, why has Japan spent decades and untold millions of dollars trying to dismantle that empire, not in the shipyard, but in the courtroom? The answer reveals more than just a commercial rivalry. The dispute is a proxy battle over two fundamentally different models of capitalism. Japan's case represents the market-oriented, rules-based trade perspective, where a level playing field is paramount. South Korea's defense is rooted in a state-directed, national champion model of development, where the government actively steers capital and resources to achieve strategic national objectives. The WTO became the arena where these two powerful and conflicting economic philosophies would collide. This is the story of that collision. The modern industrial competition between Japan and South Korea does not exist in a vacuum. It is layered upon centuries of complex and often fraught history, a dynamic of cultural exchange, political confrontation, and military conflict that stretches back millennia. From the Imjin War of the late 16th century to the Japanese colonization of the Korean peninsula from 1910 to 1945, the relationship has been haunted by deep-seated national pride and historical grievances. These historical tensions profoundly impact modern relations and fuel the intensity of their economic rivalries. After World War II and the Korean War, a new dynamic emerged. The United States, in its global ideological competition against communism, pushed for Japan, its former adversary, to participate in South Korea's economic development. This policy, formalized by the 1965 Normalization Treaty, was designed to build a strong anti-communist bloc in East Asia. It set the stage for a complex post-war relationship defined by both necessary cooperation and fierce competition. A relationship where economic interdependence was intertwined with an enduring rivalry. In the decades following World War II, Japan's shipbuilding industry rose from the ashes to become an unstoppable global force. With new equipment, imported technology, and the organizational might of its great industrial conglomerates, the Zaibatsu, Japan quickly recovered its wartime production levels. By 1957, it had surpassed its wartime peak, and from the 1960s through the 1980s, it was the undisputed king of the industry, producing roughly half of all new ship tonnage in the world. But as Japan cemented its dominance, a new challenger was emerging across the sea. In the 1970s, South Korean President Park Chung-hee launched his ambitious heavy chemical industry, HCI drive, a state-led plan to transform the nation's economy. Shipbuilding was explicitly targeted as a strategic industry, essential for the country's export-oriented growth. The government poured massive investment into the sector, selecting powerful family-run conglomerates, the chaebol, to be its chosen instruments. Hyundai, a construction firm with no shipbuilding experience, was famously tapped by Park to create a world-class shipyard, a testament to the government's direct and decisive role. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, South Korea's industry grew at a breathtaking pace, leveraging lower labor costs and an aggressive state-backed expansion strategy. The seismic shift occurred at the turn of the millennium. Around the year 2000, South Korea officially surpassed Japan in global market share, ending Japan's decades-long reign. It was a moment of immense national pride for Korea and a stunning blow to Japan's industrial prestige. This intense bilateral rivalry, however, had an unintended consequence. While Japan and Korea were locked in their struggle, a third, far larger competitor was quietly building its capacity. China's rise in shipbuilding has been nothing short of extraordinary. From a mere 5% of the global market in 2000, its share surged to over 53% by 2024. Over that same period, the combined market share of Japan and South Korea plummeted from 74% to just 42%. The decades-long fight between the two established giants created a strategic vacuum. Their focus on each other, manifested in bitter price wars and later protracted legal battles, may have blinded them to the larger competitive threat looming on the horizon. While they poured resources into their bilateral conflict, China executed a massive state-backed industrial strategy, with government support estimated at around $91 billion, that completely redrew the global map. The war between Korea and Japan, in the end, may have been a Pyrrhic conflict, weakening both and allowing a new hegemon to take the crown. To understand South Korea's meteoric rise in shipbuilding, one must first understand the unique engine that powered it, the chaebol. Literally meaning rich family or financial clique. A chaebol is a massive, family-controlled industrial conglomerate, typically consisting of multiple, highly diversified companies. These groups, names like Hyundai, Samsung, and the former Daewoo, became synonymous with Korea's economic miracle, growing from humble beginnings after the Korean War into global behemoths. The chaebol system was born out of the guided capitalism of the Park Chung-hee regime in the 1960s and 70s. The government, desperate to industrialize, forged a powerful, often collusive alliance with these firms. It provided them with special favors, protection from competition, and, most importantly, access to capital in exchange for their cooperation in achieving the state's strategic objectives. This model was inspired by the pre-war Japanese zaibatsu, but with a critical, deliberate difference. The Park regime nationalized South Korea's banks and, crucially, prohibited the chaebol from owning their own financial institutions. Unlike the Japanese zaibatsu, which were typically organized around a central bank that gave them financial independence, the Korean chaebol were made permanently dependent on the state for the vast sums of capital needed for industrial expansion. This structural choice was a masterstroke of the Korean developmental state. It created a powerful lever of control, ensuring that private enterprise would always be aligned with, and ultimately subservient to, national strategic goals. This dependency is the structural foundation of the entire WTO dispute that would erupt decades later. The primary instrument for this state-directed capitalism was the Korea Development Bank, or KDB. Established by law in 1954, the KDB's explicit mandate was to supply and manage major industrial capital to develop Korean industries and the national economy. It was not a commercial bank in the Western sense. It was a policy bank, an extension of the government's economic planning ministry. The KDB's role was pivotal. It channeled state-sponsored cheap loans to favored industries, guaranteed the foreign loans needed to import technology, and took the lead in corporate restructuring for firms deemed vital to the national interest. When the government decided that Korea must become a shipbuilding power, it was the KDB that provided the financial muscle to make it happen, funding the creation of massive shipyards for chaebol that had never built a ship before. This system of state-directed finance fostered incredible growth, but it also created enormous risks. The chaebol grew not always because they were profitable, but simply because they had access to vast, government-guaranteed loans. They expanded relentlessly into dozens of industries, often with dangerously high levels of debt. By 1999, a quarter of all manufacturers in South Korea were not earning enough to even meet the interest payments on their debts. This created a too-big-to-fail doctrine. The shipbuilding giants, in particular, became so large and so integral to Korea's exports and employment that their failure was seen as a direct threat to the nation's economic stability. This perception justified massive state-led interventions and bailouts whenever the cyclical shipbuilding industry entered a downturn. This practice of rescuing national champions, born from the very structure of the Korean model, is precisely what Japan would later challenge at the WTO as an unfair and illegal subsidy. The system that built an empire also contained the seeds of an international legal war. No company better exemplifies the strengths and weaknesses of the Korean model than Daewoo Shipbuilding and Marine Engineering, or DSME. The story of its struggles is ground zero for the WTO dispute. The saga began with the spectacular collapse of its parent, the Daewoo Group, in 1999. It was one of the largest corporate bankruptcies in world history at the time, with staggering debts of around $50 billion. DSME was spun off as an independent company in 2000, but it remained chronically troubled, lurching from one crisis to the next. The situation reached a critical point in 2016, when a massive accounting fraud scandal was uncovered. The South Korean Board of Audit and Inspection found that the company had hidden 1.5 trillion won, approximately $1.35 billion, in losses on its books. The revelation sent shockwaves through the industry, leading to a suspension of DSME's shares and pushing the already struggling shipyard to the brink of collapse. With DSME facing insolvency, the Korean state, through its financial arms, stepped in. This was not the first time, nor would it be the last. The interventions became a repeating cycle, providing the very ammunition Japan would use in its WTO complaints. The first major rescue came in 2015. As a global downturn in shipping hammered the industry, DSME, already fragile, began to buckle. The Korea Development Bank, KDB, and the Export-Import Bank of Korea, KEXIM, orchestrated a massive bailout, injecting 4.2 trillion won, about $3.7 billion, in loans and equity to keep the company afloat. But the relief was temporary. Just 17 months later, in March 2017, DSME was again on the verge of defaulting on its debts. The government and the state banks were forced to act again, orchestrating an even more complex rescue package. This included 2.9 trillion won, $2.6 billion, in fresh loans and a sweeping debt restructuring. A significant portion of DSME's debt was converted into equity through a debt-for-equity swap, a move that dramatically increased the KDB's ownership stake and made the state-run bank the shipyard's majority shareholder. This intervention was drastic, designed to slash DSME's astronomical debt ratio, which had ballooned to an unsustainable 2,732%. Even after these massive interventions, DSME's troubles were not over. In 2019, a proposed merger with its rival, Hyundai Heavy Industries (HHI), which was seen as a final solution to stabilize the company, was blocked by European Union competition regulators. This left the KDB, after more than 2 decades as the shipyard's main creditor and shareholder, still holding the bag. Finally, in late 2022, a buyer was found. The Hanwha Group, a major defense and chemicals chaebol, agreed to acquire a controlling stake in DSME for 2 trillion won, $1.5 billion, a deal again supported by the KDB. This long, painful history of collapses and rescues forms the central pillar of the entire WTO dispute. Each bailout, each loan, each debt-for-equity swap was meticulously documented by Japan and presented as evidence of an unfair, state-sponsored advantage. The decision to repeatedly rescue DSME was about more than just one company. It was a defense of the entire Korean export-led development model. The too-big-to-fail shipbuilders were national champions, symbols of Korea's industrial prowess. Allowing one of the big three to go under would have been a tacit admission that the state-directed strategy had a fundamental, fatal flaw. For policymakers in Seoul, the immense financial cost of the bailouts was deemed less severe than the political and ideological cost of letting the model itself collapse. It was a strategic imperative to save the company, regardless of the price or the looming threat of a legal war in Geneva. After years of raising concerns in bilateral talks and at multilateral forums like the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, Japan decided the time for talk was over. In November 2018, Tokyo laid down the legal gauntlet, formally requesting dispute consultations with South Korea at the World Trade Organization. This case, officially designated Dispute DS-571, marked the beginning of a new, highly confrontational phase in the shipbuilding rivalry. The initial consultations failed to resolve the issue. Just over a year later, in January 2020, Japan escalated the conflict, filing a second, even broader complaint known as Dispute DS-594. This wasn't just a follow-up. It was a comprehensive assault on what Japan viewed as a systemic and illegal government intervention in the market. The European Union, which had fought its own battle with Korea over shipbuilding in the early 2000s, quickly signaled its support for Japan's position, joining the consultations as a third party and underscoring the international dimension of the dispute. Japan's legal case was built on the foundation of the World Trade Organization's Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures, SCM Agreement, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, 1994. Tokyo's central claim was that the array of financial support measures provided to struggling Korean shipyards, most notably DSME, were not legitimate commercial transactions. Instead, they were illegal subsidies that distorted the global market and caused serious injury to Japanese shipbuilders. In its detailed submissions to the WTO, Japan identified a long list of challenged measures. These included corporate restructuring measures, the multi-billion-dollar bailouts for DSME, STX Offshore and Shipbuilding, and others, led by state-owned entities. Non-commercial financing, providing loans at below-market interest rates, equity infusions on terms no private investor would accept, and debt-for-equity swaps that unfairly favored the company. Guarantees and insurance, offering loan guarantees and other forms of insurance for new ship orders on non-commercial terms, reducing risk for both the shipyards and their customers. Dedicated support programs, the creation of new state-backed entities like the Korea Ocean Business Corporation, KOBC, which was established with a multi-billion-dollar budget to finance the purchase of new Korean-built ships. Japan argued these measures constituted both producer support, direct financing that kept otherwise insolvent companies alive, and sales support, which enabled them to offer artificially low prices to win international contracts. The result, Japan claimed, was suppressed global ship prices and a significant loss of market share for its own industry. This is where the case becomes legally complex and where Japan faced its greatest challenge. To win its case, it wasn't enough to show that Korea had provided financial support. Under Article 3.1a of the SCM agreement, the most powerful type of claim is against a prohibited subsidy, which is a subsidy that is, in law or in fact, contingent upon export performance. De jure, in law, contingency. This would mean a law or regulation explicitly states that a company will only receive the subsidy if it exports its products. This is rare and was not the case here. De facto, in fact, contingency. This is much harder to prove. It means that while not written in law, the facts demonstrate that the subsidy is implicitly tied to exporting. The granting of the subsidy is conditional on anticipated export performance. Japan's entire case hinged on this de facto argument. It had to convince the WTO panel that the only reason the Korean government would pour billions of dollars into a failing shipyard like DSME was with the clear anticipation and expectation that the company would use those funds to win export orders on the global market. The argument was that the bailouts were effectively a blank check to underbid competitors, making the financial support implicitly conditional on future exports. This is an incredibly high legal bar to clear, requiring the panel to infer intent from a complex web of financial transactions and government actions. Ultimately, Japan's WTO strategy was a high-stakes legal gambit. It was an attempt to use the mechanisms of international trade law to force a fundamental change in a rival nation's domestic industrial policy. The goal was less about recovering damages for a few lost ship orders, and more about establishing a landmark WTO precedent that the entire state-led, chaebol-rescuing, too-big-to-fail model that had powered Korea's industrial rise was, in fact, illegal under the rules of global trade. It was an ambitious, systemic challenge aimed at the very DNA of the Korean economic miracle. Faced with Japan's comprehensive legal assault, South Korea's response was swift and defiant. From the outset, Seoul maintained that Japan's claims were entirely groundless. In official statements and submissions to the WTO, the Korean government argued that all financial measures taken were fully compliant with international norms and WTO regulations. The cornerstone of Korea's defense was a crucial semantic and legal distinction. The financial support provided to DSME and other shipyards, Seoul argued, was not a subsidy intended to distort trade. Rather, it was a necessary and legitimate corporate restructuring, or normalization, effort undertaken by the company's creditors. The goal was to prevent a catastrophic bankruptcy that would have sent shockwaves through the entire Korean economy, threatening tens of thousands of jobs and a critical supply chain. This framing was designed to shift the debate away from trade distortion and towards the sovereign right of a nation to manage its own economic crises. In making this argument, South Korea was not treading on new ground. It had a powerful precedent in its back pocket from a previous battle. In the early 2000s, the European Union had brought a very similar case to the WTO, alleging that the Korean government's support for restructuring its shipyards in the wake of the 1997 Asian financial crisis constituted illegal subsidies. That earlier dispute, which concluded with a final panel report in 2005, ended in a major victory for Seoul. The WTO panel largely accepted Korea's arguments, finding that the EU had failed to prove that the restructuring measures were WTO inconsistent subsidies. This ruling was a landmark victory for Korea. It validated its approach to corporate restructuring and gave its legal team immense confidence that its defense against Japan, which was based on the same fundamental principles, was legally sound and defensible. The most sophisticated and critical element of Korea's defense was the argument that the KDB and other state-linked banks were not acting as arms of the government providing a handout. Instead, they were acting as rational commercial actors, making difficult but sensible business decisions. This argument directly attacks the definition of a benefit as required under the SCM agreement. A subsidy only exists if a benefit is thereby conferred. Korea argued that no such benefit was conferred because the actions of the KDB were consistent with what a private market actor would have done in the same circumstances. The logic proceeds as follows. The KDB was already DSME's largest creditor, with billions of dollars of exposure. If DSME were to enter bankruptcy and be liquidated, the KDB would have lost its entire investment. Therefore, providing additional financing and restructuring the existing debt, through complex financial instruments like debt for equity swaps and bond rollovers, was the most commercially rational strategy. It was an attempt to salvage their massive initial investment and give the company a chance to recover, with the ultimate goal of eventually being repaid. This defense masterfully weaponized the complexity of modern finance. It transformed the dispute from a simple question of, did the government give money, to a much more nuanced and difficult question. Were the terms of that financial support something a private commercial bank might have offered in a similar high-risk workout situation? By framing the bailouts in the sophisticated language of creditor-led normalization, Korea blurred the line between a sovereign government action and a private financial workout. This created an incredibly high evidentiary bar for Japan, forcing the WTO panel of trade law experts to become arbiters of complex financial risk assessment. It forced them to answer a difficult hypothetical, creating the reasonable doubt needed to fend off Japan's claims. It was a brilliant strategy of using legal and financial complexity as a shield. The legal battle waged in the halls of the WTO did not produce the clear, decisive victory that Japan had hoped for. The panel reports in these cases are extraordinarily complex, but the overarching outcome is one of ambiguity. Japan failed to achieve its primary strategic objective, a sweeping condemnation of South Korea's entire model of state-led support for its shipbuilding industry. The core reason for this outcome lies in the immense legal difficulty of meeting the burden of proof, particularly for a de facto export subsidy claim. As outlined in cases like Canada, aircraft, a complaining party must establish a tight, demonstrable link between the financial contribution and the anticipation of export earnings. This requires more than just showing that a bailed-out company is an exporter. It requires evidence that the subsidy was conditional on exporting. Proving this kind of implicit conditionality in a complex corporate restructuring involving dozens of financial instruments and years of transactions is a Herculean legal task. While Japan may have succeeded on some narrower procedural points, the WTO panels have historically been reluctant to second-guess the complex economic and financial judgments made by a sovereign government in the midst of a potential economic crisis. The Korean defense, which framed the bailouts as a rational commercial decision by creditors to save their investment, proved difficult to definitively disprove. The result was not a clear vindication of either side, but a legal stalemate that allowed the underlying conflict to fester. The inconclusive nature of the dispute has been profoundly compounded by a much larger, systemic crisis within the WTO itself. Since late 2019, the WTO's appellate body, effectively its Supreme Court and the final arbiter of trade disputes, has been non-functional. The United States, expressing long-standing dissatisfaction with what it views as judicial overreach by the body, has systematically blocked the appointment of new members, leaving the 7-member court without the minimum number of adjudicators required to hear cases. This institutional paralysis has created a situation where any country that loses a case at the initial panel stage can simply appeal the report into the void. Because there is no functioning appellate body to hear the appeal, the case enters a state of permanent legal limbo. The panel report can never be formally adopted by the WTO's dispute settlement body, and it therefore never becomes legally binding. The Japan-Korea shipbuilding dispute is a direct victim of this collapse. The complaints were filed in 2018 and 2020, meaning their entire legal life cycle has taken place during this period of systemic breakdown. Regardless of what the panel decides, a final binding resolution is currently impossible. This reality transforms the dispute from a legal process with a clear endpoint into a true war of attrition, fought in a courthouse with no final judge. The case is trapped, not necessarily by its own legal merits, but by the larger geopolitical forces that have fractured the multilateral trading system it was designed to uphold.